Everyone in Sweetwater Bend agreed on one thing the morning the freight wagon set Adelheid Bauer down in the road with a crate of chickens and a carpet-bag. The blonde bride and her hens would be dead or gone by winter. She was 23 years old, standing in the rutted main street of a Dakota Territory town she had never seen, with $11.40 knotted into the hem of her skirt, a marriage she had not yet laid eyes on the other half of, and 41 live birds shifting and complaining inside a slatted crate at her feet. The men on the porch of the mercantile looked at the crate, and then they looked at her flaxen braid coming loose under a cheap straw hat, and they smiled the way men smile when they have already decided how a story ends. She did not smile back. She crouched down in the dust, worked her fingers through the slats, and counted the birds with her lips moving, the way her grandmother had taught her to count anything that mattered. 41, the same 41 she had loaded at the Yankton stockyard 4 days before. She had not lost one on the road, not one to the heat, nor the jolting, nor the long dry stretches where the water barrel ran low, and that was the first small fact she held on to, standing there in the dust with the whole town deciding she was finished. A boy of about 10 with a freckled nose drifted up close to the crate, the way children do, and peered in at the birds. "Them's chickens," he announced to nobody. "They are," Adelheid said. Her English came out careful and squared off at the corners, each word set down like a brick. 30 brown leghorns, 8 Dominiques, 3 roosters, 41. My pa says you won't keep 'em through one frost." "Your pa," she said, "has not met these chickens." And she went on counting. The boy lingered. He had the look of a child who is told a great deal and listened to very little, and he watched her count with his head tipped to one side. "What are their names?" "Chickens do not have names," Adelheid said, and then, because the boy's face fell, she relented. "That one, the old gray rooster standing up so scolding, his name is Pfarrer. It means the preacher in the German." The boy laughed, a real laugh, the first sound of welcome she had heard in Sweetwater Bend, and she marked him in her mind as the one soul in town who had not yet decided how her story ended. His name was Thomas Voss, and he was the mercantile keeper's boy, and 3 years on he would be carrying egg cases to the depot for wages and telling every stranger who would listen that he had been there in the road the very first morning and had known. But that was 3 years off. Just now he was a freckled boy crouched by a crate, and the men on the porch behind him were already laughing. Before I take you any further into Adelheid's first winter on the high plains, do me one small kindness. If you like stories about people the world wrote off too early, tap that like button and leave me a comment telling me what city or town you're listening from tonight. I read every single one of them, and it tells me where in this wide country these old frontier stories are still finding a warm kitchen to be heard in. Go ahead and do that now, and then come back, because the man who was supposed to marry Adelheid Bauer had been dead for 9 days, and nobody in Sweetwater Bend had thought to send her a letter. She found that out from the station master, a thin man named Orrin Task, who kept the freight ledgers and the town's bad news in the same careful hand. He came out to the road wiping his spectacles on his shirt tail and stood a moment working up to it, the way a decent man works up to a hard thing. "You'd be the Bauer woman," he said. "Come for Tom Pell." "I am Adelheid Bauer," she said. "Yes, for Mr. Pell." "Ma'am." He put the spectacles back on as though he needed them to say it. Tom Pell went through the ice on the Jim River the second week of the thaw, chasing a steer that had no more sense than to walk out onto it. We buried him on the rise behind the Lutheran ground 9 days back. He looked at his own boots. There wasn't a good way to reach you once you'd left Yankton. I'm sorry, I truly am. Adelheid Bower stood very still. The wind came down off the short grass plain and moved the loose hair against her cheek, and behind her the 41 birds muttered and scratched at the crate floor, and for a long moment she did not say anything at all. The boy with the freckles had gone quiet. Somewhere a wagon creaked. She looked at the rise behind the church, where she could just make out the raw line of new graves, and she let herself feel it for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was not long, and then she asked the only question that would keep her alive. Whose land is it now, the place Mr. Pell filed on? Orrin Task blinked, because that was not the question he had braced himself for. Ma'am, the claim. Does a dead man's promise carry any weight in a territory clerk's office, or does it not? So he told her the truth, because he was that kind of man. The claim was a quarter section out past the creek, 160 acres of dry grass and one half-built soddy with no roof on the east room. Tom Pell had filed it under the homestead law, but he had not yet proved up. He had not lived the years, nor made the improvements the government required to turn a claim into a deed. The land just now belonged to nobody and to everybody. If she walked away, it would revert, and some other family would file on it inside a month. If she stayed and filed in her own name, she could try to prove it up herself. But, ma'am, he added, and here he lowered his voice, though there was no one near, a woman alone, with no man and no money and no team and no crop in the ground. Folks'll lay good odds you quit before the first hard frost. I don't say it to be unkind. I say it so you go in with your eyes open. How long? She asked. Until the first hard frost? He thought about it honestly. 8 weeks, maybe 9, in a kind year. The killing cold comes later, but the first frost'll be on you by the back end of September. $11.40, 41 chickens, 8 weeks. She looked once more at the rise behind the church, said a word in German under her breath that might have been a prayer for a man she'd never met, and then she picked up the carpet bag, hooked 2 fingers through the rope handle of the crate, and asked Orrin Task to point her toward the creek. The men on the mercantile porch watched her go. The biggest of them, a cattle buyer named Cyrus Lofton, who wore a good broadcloth coat and a worse temper, tipped his chair back and said it loud enough to carry the length of the street. $5 says the German hen wife is on the eastbound by October. I'll take that, said the man next to him, a horse trader. Make it October. She might not last September. October, said Lofton. I'm a sporting man. A few of them laughed. Somebody always takes the bet, and somebody always laughs. Adelheid Bower kept walking, the crate banging against her shin with every step, the birds inside her only fortune in the world, and she did not look back at them once. But she heard it. She heard every word of it. She filed it away the way she filed away the number 41, and she carried it out past the creek to use later when she was ready. The soddy was worse than Orrin Task had let on. The walls were good, thick blocks of prairie sod cut and stacked like brick, 2 feet through, the kind of wall that holds the cool in summer and the warm in winter and laughs at the wind. But the east room had no roof, just the bare ridgepole and a sky going the color of dishwater, and the floor was packed dirt, gone to mud, where the rain had come in through the open ridge, and a family of prairie voles had moved into the corner where a bed should have been and looked up at her without much concern. There was a cold iron stove with a cracked firebox door, a rough plank table with one short leg, a three-legged stool, and a deed-shaped hole in her life where a husband should have been. On the table, left behind by the dead man, was a single tin cup and a folded square of paper. She unfolded the paper. It was a letter half-written in a clumsy hand. "Dear Miss Bower," it began, "I have not got the words a educated man would have, but I will tell you true. The land is hard, but the soil along the creek bottom is black and good, and I have built the wall stout. We will not be rich, but we will not go hungry neither if we—" And there it stopped, mid-sentence, mid-word, where Tom Pell had set down his pencil to go chase a steer onto the spring ice. Adelheid Bower stood in the roofless room, holding the unfinished letter of a man she would never meet, who had built her good stout walls and meant for her not to go hungry, and she folded the paper back along its crease and put it in her bodice next to nothing at all, because she had nothing else to keep there yet. Then she walked down to the creek bottom he'd written about and dug her fingers into the bank, and the man had not lied. Under the dry crust the soil was black and crumbling and rich, the kind of bottom-land dirt that grows anything you ask of it. He had told her the truth in a half-written letter from beyond the grave. She decided, kneeling in his good black dirt, that she would not waste it. She did 3 things before dark, and the order of them tells you everything about Adelheid Bower. She did not build a fire, and she did not cry. First she carried the crate inside and set it gently in the room that still had a roof. Then she walked the dry creek bed until she found a seep where the bank stayed damp, and she dug down with her hands in a flat creek stone until brown water welled up, and she let it settle clear in the tin cup and drank. And then, with the last gray of the light, she opened the crate. 41 birds came out into the sod-walled room, blinking and complaining, and she watched them the way a banker watches the door of a vault. 30 were brown leghorns, lean, nervous, quick hens with bright single combs flopped over one eye, the kind of bird her grandmother in the old country had sworn would lay you an egg nearly every day of its life if you fed it and kept it from freezing and never once let it get fat or idle. 8 were Dominiques, the gray-barred American hens, heavier and calmer than the leghorns, slower to lay but steady, the best mothers and the best foragers, and the hardiest in the cold of any barnyard fowl she knew. And 3 were roosters, 2 young leghorn cockerels with murder and ambition in their eyes, and 1 old barred Dominique rooster she had named Fahrer, the German word for the preacher, because he stood up tall on the table edge and scolded the whole room as though it had missed church. 41 birds, 30 layers, 8 layers, and mothers, 3 to make more. That was the whole of it. That was the empire. She slept that first night in her coat on the dirt floor with the crate beside her, and the birds murmuring and settling in the dark, and somewhere out past the creek a coyote tuned up and sang, and the wind worked at the open east room and found the gaps and moved through them, and Adelheid Bower lay awake on the cold ground doing arithmetic. $11.40. If a laying hen ate 2 ounces of grain a day, and grain cost at the mercantile what Orrin Task had said it cost, then her whole fortune would feed 41 birds for— She did the figures twice in the dark, because you check a number that matters. 11 days. 11 days. And then the chickens that were supposed to save her would starve instead. And the town would be right. And she would be on the October eastbound exactly as Cyrus Lofton had wagered. 11 days. Unless she found a way to feed 41 birds for 8 weeks without buying a single sack of grain. She lay there a long while, turning it. She thought of her grandmother's hands, brown and sure, scattering the morning grain in the snow of a Bavarian dooryard, and of the thing the old woman had said so often that the girl had stopped hearing it. A hen is the poor woman's bank, child, because she takes the things nobody else will buy. The bug, the weed seed, the table scrap, the spilled grain in the dirt, and she turns them into an egg, which is money, and she does it every day of her life if you only let her. The poor woman's bank. Adelheid Bauer had come to America with a bank of 41 birds and $11.40, and not 1 acre she could yet call her own. And lying there in the cold and the dark, with the wind in the open ridge, she made herself a promise in 2 languages that she would not break for the rest of her life. She would not touch the $11 to feed a hen. She would feed her bank off the land, free, and she would let the land's own bugs and weeds and spilled grain do exactly what her grandmother said they would do, and turn themselves into eggs, which were money. And she would build from there, or she would build from nothing, but she would not spend her last dollars feeding what was meant to feed her. Then she slept 2 hours, and the gray light came, and the prairie kept its half of the bargain before she had even finished making it. In the gray of the morning she found it. It had been there all along, all around her, singing in the grass. She woke to a sound like soft rain that was not rain, a dry rustling tick and whir that came up out of the short grass plain in every direction, thousands on thousands of grasshoppers working through the late summer grass, the plague the ranchers cursed because a heavy flight of hoppers could strip a hayfield to bare stubble in a single hot afternoon. Adelheid Bauer stood in the doorway of the roofless room and looked out at the grass moving and crawling with insects clear to the horizon. And then she turned and looked back at 30 brown leghorns who would chase down a grasshopper the way a child chases a dropped sweet. And for the first time since the freight wagon set her down in the road, she smiled all the way. She let the flock out. She had no wire, no fence, no yard, nothing to keep a bird in or a coyote out, nothing but 160 acres of grass that was crawling with the richest free feed a chicken ever dreamed of. So she simply opened the door and let 41 hungry birds out into it. The leghorns went half mad with the joy of it, running and snapping and leaping after the hoppers that sprang up under their feet, their crops filling and rounding out as she watched. The 8 Dominiques worked slower and lower, heads down, scratching through the grass roots for the grubs and the ticks and the fat beetles underneath, eating the very pests that plagued the cattle. By noon, every crop in the flock was full and tight as a drum. She had not fed them so much as a handful of grain, and they had eaten better than they had eaten in the crate, and they would do it again tomorrow and the day after, as long as the hoppers lasted and the grass held grubs, which, on 160 acres of unbroken Dakota sod, was a very long time. But a hen cannot live on grasshoppers alone, and Adelheid Bauer knew it down to her bones. A laying hen needs grit in her gizzard to grind her food into something she can use, because a bird has no teeth, and the gizzard does the chewing with swallowed stone. And a laying hen needs lime, hard lime, to build the shell of an egg, or she will lay you a poor soft egg with no shell at all, just a skin, or she will stop laying altogether and turn her body's lime to keeping herself alive. So that afternoon, Adelheid Bower walked the creek and the bluff and gathered what the country gave for nothing. Down on the damp creek bank, she found the little spiral shells of land snails by the hundred, full of the lime she needed, and she filled a fold of her apron. On a gravel bar in the creek bend, she found coarse, sharp grit and filled the other fold. And up on the bluff, weathering white in the sun, she found the great bleached skull and ribs of a buffalo dead these 10 years, and she broke the brittle bone up small with a stone, because ground bone makes the hardest shell of all, and a hen knows it and will eat it gladly. Grit, lime, and bone, all of it lying free on the land for anyone with the eyes to see a fortune in a snail shell. And along the creek bottom, where the sod had never once been broken by a plow, she found the wild grasses standing heavy and ripe and bowing with seed in the September sun, wild millet, the bristled heads of foxtail heavy enough to bend the stalk, the small, hard, nourishing seeds the buffalo grass lets down in the fall, free feed, every ounce of it, growing thick on the land she now meant to call her own. She stripped the seed heads into her apron by the double handful until her apron sagged with the weight, and she carried it back and spread it on the table to dry, and that was a second day's feed laid by, and a third, and the start of a winter store. She found other things on those long gathering walks that the country handed her for nothing if she only had the eyes. She found a stand of wild sunflowers gone to head along an old buffalo wallow, the black seeds fat with oil, and a hen fed oily seed lays through the coal better and grows a thicker feather against it, which is a plain fact of the bird and not a guess. She found in a wet swale the green of late chickweed and lamb's quarter that a hen will eat like a child eats greens it has been promised a sweet for, and which keeps a winter hen's comb red and her body sound when the grass is gone. She found the wallow itself worth knowing, for the loose dry dust in the bottom of it. A hen must bathe in dust to keep the mites and the lice from eating her alive, there being no water bath that will do it. And Adelheid Bower hauled basketfuls of that fine wallow dust home and made a dusting box in the corner of the coop, and her hen stayed clean and bright all winter, while many a coddled town flock went bare and itching. 11 days of grain in her purse, and a whole prairie of free feed and free medicine at her door, she would not spend a cent of her $11.40 on a chicken's belly, not one single cent, and the figure in her hymn stayed whole. But there was one thing the land could not give her, and so the next morning she walked into Sweetwater Bend. The filing came first, before a roof, before anything, because without her name on a piece of paper, the whole 160 acres and every snail and grasshopper on it belonged to somebody else. The land office was a single room with a counter, and behind the counter sat a sallow young clerk named Bertram, who plainly wished himself anywhere on earth but there. He looked up at the blonde woman with the cracked apron and the careful English, and he sighed before she'd said a word. "I have come to file," she said. "On the Pell Quarter, in my own name. I am told the law allows it." Bertram set down his pen and looked almost surprised to be saying it. It does. A single woman of full age can file and prove up a homestead claim, same as a man. Live on it, improve it, stick out the years required. The law don't care what you are so long as you do the work. He pulled a form toward him. Filing fees $14. Adelheid Bauer had $11.40. She stood at the counter and felt the whole bed of the town pressing on the back of her neck like a hand, and she did not flinch, and she did not let her face change. "Will the law take a partial fee?" she asked, "and a note for the rest?" "It will not," Bertram said, not unkindly. "Law's the law. $14, all of it, or no filing." She thought. She was very good at thinking under a weight. May the fee be paid by anyone, or only by the one who files? Bertram allowed that anyone's coin was good coin. The government did not ask whose pocket the $14 came out of, and that was the crack in the wall she needed. She thanked him, said she would return within the hour, and she walked across the rutted street to the Mercantile, where Cyrus Lofton and the horse trader still held down the porch chairs, as though the town paid them to. She walked past them without a glance, in through the door and up to the counter, where she did the hardest thing she did all that long, hard autumn. She opened her carpet-bag and offered to sell the last things she owned that were not alive, not the land, not a single hen. She took out and set on the counter one by one the only objects of value she had carried across an ocean. A set of 6 good German egg cups her grandmother had pressed on her for her wedding, white porcelain, each ringed with a single thin line of real gold, and a length of fine linen, meant for the tablecloth of a married woman's house she would now never lay. Behind the counter, the mercantile keeper's wife, a lean, sharp-eyed woman named Hetty Voss, picked up one of the egg cups and turned it to the light and saw at once that it was good, and saw the woman who was selling it, and understood the whole story in a glance, and was the sort who could not cheat a person standing that close to the edge. "These are fine," Hetty Voss said quietly, "better than anything that comes through here." She turned the cup once more, reading the thin gold line, and then she looked up and read the woman across the counter instead, and what she saw there she did not say aloud. "Egg cups," she said. "You came across an ocean to keep hens, and you carried egg cups." It was not a question, and there was something in it, close to respect. $2.70 for the cups and the linen both. It's fair. I won't go under it, and I'd be a fool to go over. She counted the coin out, and then she did one thing more. She wrapped the 6 egg cups back in the linen, careful, and set the little bundle up on the high shelf behind the counter instead of out for sale. "I'll keep these by," she said, "case you ever want to buy them back. A woman ought to have something of her grandmother's." She looked Adelheid in the eye when she said it, woman to woman, and there was no contempt in it, and it was the first kindness Sweetwater Bend had shown her, and Adelheid Bauer marked that too. "It is fair," Adelheid said. "Thank you." $11.40 plus $2.70 made $14.10. She carried it back across the street and counted 14 whole dollars onto the land office counter, and Bertram filled out the form in his cramped hand, Adelheid Bauer, claimant, the Pell Quarter, the township, and range set down, Dakota Territory, and stamped it and slid her the receipt. She walked out of the land office with a homestead claim in her own name, a half-written letter from a dead man in her bodice, and 10 cents to her name in all the wide world. Cyrus Lofton watched her come down the land office steps, folding the receipt away against her heart, and he laughed and tipped his chair and called across the street. A paper don't put a roof on a soddy henwife, nor grain in a empty crop. I'll see you on the eastbound yet. October, like I said. Adelheid Bower stopped in the middle of the road. She turned and looked at him, and it was not a hot look nor an angry one. It was the long, level, considering look of a person counting something, and it made the loud man's chair come slowly back down onto 4 legs. "You will buy eggs from me before the snow flies, Mr. Lofton," she said, "and you will pay full price." Then she turned and walked back out toward the creek, 10 cents in her hem, no roof on her house, 41 chickens eating grasshoppers in the long gold grass, to go and prove the whole loud certain town wrong. The roof came first, because a hen freezes and an egg freezes, and a roofless room in a Dakota November is a grave with a view of the stars. She had no money for milled lumber, and no team to haul it if she had the money, so she built the way the land let a poor person build. She walked the 2 miles down the creek to the nearest homestead to borrow a spade, and that is how she met the one person in that whole country who took her part from the first hour. Greta Halverson was a widow herself, a broad, weathered Norwegian woman who had buried a husband and 2 children on the rise behind her own soddy and gone on living, because the cow still needed milking, and grief does not feed the stock. She came to her door, looked at the young blonde stranger standing in her yard, and heard the whole of it in 6 plain sentences: the dead bridegroom, the roofless room, the crate of hens, the $11.40 now down to 10 cents, and a filing receipt. Greta Halverson did not say she was sorry, because she was a woman who knew that sorry feeds no one. She went into her lean-to and brought out a good sharp spade and a sod-cutting blade her own dead husband had used, and she put them in Adelheid's hands. "Cut the sod when the ground's damp of a morning, not dry of an afternoon," she said. "It comes up in a whole ribbon then, root and all, and it holds. Lay it grass to grass so the roots grab. And girl," she looked at her hard, "build the warm room for the hens, not for yourself. A cold woman lives. A cold hen quits. You sleep cold this winter, and your chickens sleep warm, and come spring you'll be the one of us laughing." It was the single best piece of advice Adelheid Bower got in all of Dakota, and it came free from a widow with a borrowed spade, and Adelheid Bower never forgot it, and never forgot her. With the spade in her hand, she went up onto the bluff and cut sod. Long, heavy ribbons of prairie turf, sliced free root and all with the spade, and a great deal of grunting, and a few words her grandmother would not have liked, each ribbon as much as she could carry. She did not roof the east room with wood, because she had none. She roofed it the way her own good walls were built. She felled 3 slim young cottonwoods along the creek and trimmed them for a frame. She laid the slimmest poles she could lift across the ridgepole and the wall plates. She wove a tight mat of willow withes and twisted prairie grass over the poles to hold the dirt. And over all of it she laid the cut sod, grass side up, 2 courses thick, root to root, so the living roots would knit the whole roof into one breathing skin. A sod roof is a heavy, humble, miraculous thing. It leaks like a sieve through the first hard rain, dripping mud, until the grass roots take hold and knit tight. And after that, it does not leak. And it does not burn the way a board roof burns when a spark catches in a dry plain summer, and it does not blow off in a norther the way shingles peel away into the dark. Once knit, a sod roof as warm as a folded wool blanket laid over the whole house. It took Adelheid Bower 9 days, working from the first gray light to the last, her palms splitting open and bleeding and scabbing and splitting again until she wrapped them in strips torn from the dead man's spare shirt. And when it was done, the soddy was whole at last. 2 rooms, walls 2 feet thick, a living roof overhead, and a banked earth floor that the small heat of a small fire could hold all night long. She did not build that warm whole room for herself. She built it for the chickens, and she made her own bed in the cold east corner of it. And that choice was the hinge on which her whole future turned. This is the thing the men on the mercantile porch never once understood, and it is the beating heart of how Adelheid Bower beat them. A hen will lay through the warm, bright months whether you coddle her or curse her. Anybody at all can gather eggs in June and July, which is exactly why eggs in June and July are worth almost nothing. But a hen stops laying when the days draw short and the cold comes down, and through the long, dead heart of a Dakota winter, from November clear to March, fresh eggs in that country were scarce as gold and dear as gold, hauled in frozen from who knew where on the slow winter trains and sold for a small fortune on the rare days they could be got at all. Adelheid Bower's grandmother had kept hens laying through black Bavarian winters, and had set fresh eggs on her own table at Christmas, while every neighbor in the valley went without. And the neighbors had called it witchery, because that was easier than doing the work. And the grandmother had taught the girl her 2 plain secrets, and the girl had carried them across an ocean and half a continent in her head, where no thief and no hard luck could take them from her. The first secret was warmth. The second secret was light. A hen lays for light and for warmth. Give her both through the dark, cold middle of the year, and she will keep laying long after every other hen in the territory has quit. So Adelheid Bower turned her own whole house into a hen house. Along the warm inner wall, where the cracked stove's heat pooled and lingered in the sod, she built the roosts, low poles, for the heavy Dominiques, and higher ones for the flighty leghorns who liked to be up out of the world. On the laying side, she floored the room a full foot deep in the dry straw and grass chaff, and she let the birds' own droppings work down into that deep bed instead of mucking it to the dirt each day. Deep litter, her grandmother had called it, and as the manure and the chaff broke down together under the surface, they gave off a slow, steady, gentle heat of their own, warming the floor of the coop from underneath. A plain, true thing any farmer knows who has ever pushed his bare hand down into a manure pile in January and felt it warm as a loaf from the oven. She kept a small fire in the cracked stove, cottonwood and dried cow chips she gathered by the apronful off the old cattle ground, banked low and close through the night, just enough to hold the killing edge off the air. And for the light, this was the part the town would have laughed loudest at, if the town had been let in to watch. She kept a single lamp burning low and steady in the coop through the long, dark hours before dawn, so that the hens woke to 14 hours of light a day when the shortening November sun would give them only 9. A hen does not read a clock. A hen counts the light. Fool her gently into believing it is still warm September, with September's long, bright days, and she will lay you September's eggs in the teeth of December. It cost her in lamp oil, and lamp oil cost money she did not have. So, through that first long month, she fed the whole flock entirely off the land, every ounce. Grasshoppers, while the flights lasted, then the wild grass seed, she had stripped and dried by the apronful. Then the grubs and frost-stunned beetles the hen scratched up from under the first thin snows, then the leavings of the prairie itself. She let the steady Dominiques range the old cattle ground along the creek where they grew fat, scratching the undigested oats out of the dried dung, which is an ugly fact and a true one, and the very reason a barnyard flock has followed the stock since the beginning of farming. She fed them the grit off the gravel bar and the lime out of the snail shells and the broken buffalo bone, so every shell came hard and whole. Every single ounce of feed that first month came free off her own 160 acres, and every cent she could scrape she spent on oil. She mended a torn harness for the widow Halverson and was paid a dime. She scrubbed the plank floor of the Lutheran church on her knees of a Saturday and was paid a quarter, and every coin of it, the dime and the quarter, and her last 10 cents besides, went straight onto the counter at the mercantile for lamp oil, because the land would give her feed for nothing, but the land would not give her light, and light was the one thing that would make her rich. The coyotes came in the first week of October, before ever a winter egg was laid, and they very nearly ended the whole thing before it began. She had been letting the flock range loose by day across the 160 acres because the free feed was out there in the grass, and a hen that ranges wide is a healthy hen, and she had been shutting them up warm in the soddy each dusk and counting them in by lamplight 3 times over, the way you count a thing that matters. But a hen will not always come home at dusk if the foraging is good, and on a still gold evening her lips stopped moving and started again, and stopped, and she counted a 4th time and a 5th, and the number would not change. 38. She was 3 birds short. 3 brown leghorns had stayed out in the grass past the dark, and a coyote was already singing somewhere down past the creek. A smaller woman would have shut the door on the 38 she had and prayed for the 3. Adelheid Bauer lit a second lantern and took up the dead man's old single-barrel fowling piece from its pegs behind the door. She had found it her first week and cleaned the rust from it and learned its weight and its kick-out behind the soddy at a fence post, because a woman alone on 160 acres learns a gun the way she learns a stove, all the way through before she needs it. She went out into the dark after her 3 hens. She found them in the worst way. She found 2 of them by their feathers, scattered pale across the black grass down near the creek, and she found the coyote standing over the 3rd, a young leghorn pullet still alive and shrieking, and Adelheid Bauer did not hesitate and did not shut her eyes. She brought the fowling piece up to her shoulder, and she fired, and the coyote dropped where it stood, and she gathered up that one torn, trembling bird against her chest and carried it back to the warm coop with the smoking gun in her other hand and her own heart going like a trip hammer. She sat up that whole night by the stove with the torn pullet in a basket beside the warmth, working clean rag and warm water against its hurts. But a bird that a coyote has had its teeth in is a bird mostly already gone, and it died before the gray light without ever once standing up again. So she came out of that night with 38 birds, where she had begun with 41 or 35 laying hens now, and her 3 roosters, for all 3 of the lost were laying hens, and the roosters had stayed shut safe inside. A flock on the frontier is a fallen thing. Left alone it only ever goes down, and never of itself goes up, and every loss is a loss for keeps, until the spring brings broody hens to make the number climb again. By that gray morning she had done her hard thinking and had her answer, and the answer cost her. She spent real coin, not on comfort, never once on comfort, on the last of her woven wire, and on a load of split cottonwood rails she traded a fortnight of future eggs against, and she built her ranging flock a fenced yard. The posts sunk deep, and the wire turned under, and buried a full hand's depth at the bottom, so that nothing could dig beneath it in the night. She shut the gate on it each dusk thereafter, and she lost not one more bird to the dark that whole long first winter. The coyote's hide she pegged out and dried on the south wall of the soddy, and when folk asked her about it later, she said only that the prairie taught its lessons once and charged full price for the schooling, and that a wise woman paid the tuition and did not need a second teaching. The first egg of the cold season came on a frost-white morning in the second week of October. She went into the warm lamp-lit coop in the dark before dawn, slid her hand under a brown leghorn settled deep in the straw, and brought out an egg, still warm from the body of the hen, white, smooth, heavy, perfect in her cracked palm. She stood there in the soft lamplight, holding it as though it were the first egg laid since the creation of the world. Outside her 2-foot walls, every other hen house for 40 miles in any direction had gone silent and dark for the winter. Inside Adelheid Bauer's warm sod house on a frosted October morning, a hen had just laid. That first day she gathered 4 eggs. The next morning, 6. By the end of October, with the flock settled and warm and lit and well fed, she was lifting between 20 and 26 eggs a day out of the straw, from 35 laying hens. The 2 leghorn cockerels and old Farrar the preacher laid nothing, of course, and 3 of the older hens were resting through a molt. And she stood in her doorway each white morning with a basket of warm eggs, steaming faintly in a country where eggs had vanished with the first frost. And she understood, the way you understand a thing in your marrow and not your head, that she was going to win. But understanding a thing and proving it to a town that has bet against you are 2 different countries, and the only road between them ran straight up the main street of Sweetwater Bend. She carried her first dozen to town on the last day of October, the eggs bedded in straw in a flat basket on her arm, and she walked into the mercantile where Hetty Voss kept the counter and asked what the store would give for fresh-laid eggs. Hetty Voss looked down at the dozen eggs, white and brown together, the way a person looks at a clutch of diamonds set out on a feed store counter, because on that date, in that country, that is very nearly what they were. "Lord above," Hetty said softly, "fresh eggs. We haven't had a fresh egg to sell in 3 weeks. The last we got came up frozen and half spoiled on the train out of Sioux Falls, and went for 30 cents the dozen, cracks and all, and folks fought over them." She did sums in her head, the storekeeper habit. "I can give you 20 cents the dozen for these, and be glad to." Adelheid Bauer did not take 20 cents. She had crossed an ocean. She had buried in her heart at least a husband she had never met, in a graveyard she would never visit. She had paid the very last dime she owned for a piece of paper, roofed a house with cut grass, broken her hands raw, and turned her own bed cold to keep a flock of chickens warm. And she had not done 1 ounce of all of that to hand her single hard-won advantage to a store at 20 cents the dozen. She thanked Hetty Voss kindly and sincerely, said she believed she would try selling direct, and she walked back out onto the main street with her basket of warm eggs on her arm, and she went door to door. She knocked first at the Lutheran parsonage, where the pastor's wife had 4 growing children and had not cooked with a fresh egg since September, and she sold all she could and took an order for more. She knocked at the door of the Drover's Hotel, where the cook came to the door wiping his hands and went still at the sight of a fresh egg, as though Adelheid had brought him news from home. 4 dozen a week, he said. Every week, all winter, whatever you can spare, and I'll take it. 30 cents the dozen, and I'll not haggle a fresh egg in November. I'm not a madman. She knocked at the doctor's house, where a child lay sick with a low fever, and the doctor's wife wanted eggs for a custard to tempt the girl to eat. And Adelheid Bauer would not take 1 cent for those, and pressed a half dozen into the woman's hands, and went on before she could argue. And the doctor, when he heard of it, remembered it, the way a doctor in a small town remembers who is kind. By the time the early dark came down, she had sold every egg she carried and taken standing orders for more eggs than her flock could yet lay, and she had taken it all at 30 cents the dozen, paid in coin into her own 2 hands, while Cyrus Lofton watched the whole circuit of it from the mercantile porch and, for once in his loud life, said nothing at all. Word of a thing like that does not stay put in a small town. It runs like fire in dry grass. Inside a week, half of Sweetwater Bend wanted to know how on earth the German hen wife had fresh eggs to sell in November, when nobody else in 500 miles had laid eyes on one since the first frost. Some said she must be feeding her birds something unnatural to force them. Some said the eggs would surely make you sick, that an egg laid out of its season was an egg that wasn't right. And a loud woman named Prudence Lofton, who was Cyrus's older sister and had every ounce of his charity and none of his nerve, stood up in the middle of the church sewing circle and declared that no decent Christian hen laid out of season, that a hen forced to lay through the killing cold was a hen worked to her death by an unnatural foreign witchery, and that the eggs would carry the worse of it into any house that bought them. It was exactly the kind of talk that can kill a young business stone dead before it draws a second breath, and Adelheid Bauer knew it, and she did the only thing a person can do with a lie that big and that public. She did not argue it in the street. She invited the whole sewing circle out to her soddy to see for themselves. They came on a cold, bright Saturday afternoon, 8 women of Sweetwater Bend in their second-best dresses, half of them hoping to be horrified, and the other half hoping not to be, with Prudence Lofton marching at the head of the column with her chin up and her mind made up. Adelheid Bauer met them in her swept dooryard, dried her hands on her apron, and took them inside, and she showed them everything, hiding nothing. There was no witchery to find. There was a clean, warm, lamp-lit room that smelled of dry, sweet straw, and not at all of filth, because she forked the soiled litter daily and kept the bed fresh. There were 35 glossy, bright-combed, bright-eyed, contented hens, scratching and murmuring in the deep, clean litter, with the 3 roosters strutting among them. There was the banked stove ticking with low heat, the single steady lamp, the roosts along the warm inner wall, the box of grit, the dish of crushed snail-shell lime, the basket of dried grass seed. And there were the eggs, warm, clean, white and brown, perfect, gathered out of the straw while the women watched, the very same eggs any hen anywhere lays, only laid in a month, when every other hen in the country had quit. "There is no trick," Adelheid Bauer said, in her careful, square-cornered English, to the 8 women standing in her warm room with the cold pressing at their backs through the open door. A hen lays for warmth and for light. That is all. In the old country, my grandmother's hens laid at Christmas while the neighbors went without. And the neighbors called it witchery, too, because it is far easier to call a thing witchery than it is to keep a lamp burning and a fire banked through a whole cold winter for the sake of a chicken. You are all welcome to as many eggs as you can pay for. They will not make your children sick. They will keep them well through the lean months. That is the only magic here. A lamp, a fire, and a great deal of getting up in the dark. Prudence Lofton had ridden out to find a witch and had found instead a tired, clear-eyed young woman with split and bandaged hands standing straight-backed in a clean, warm room full of fat, healthy birds, and there is nothing on the green earth harder to argue against than a plain fact you came all that way to disprove and could not. She stood a long moment. Then she bought 24 eggs before she left, and she paid the full 30 cents the dozen without a word of haggle. And on the long ride back to town, she was very quiet, and the sewing circle of Sweetwater Bend never breathed another word against Adelheid Bower from that day forward. Most of those 8 women became her steady customers. 3 of them in time became her friends. That is how it goes with a small town once it finally decides to come around. It comes around all at once, in a body, and then pretends it had never stood anywhere else. Cyrus Lofton did not come around so easily, and in the 3rd week of November he made his one real try at running her out. And it is worth telling because it is the day Adelheid Bower beat him in the open in front of the whole town without ever raising her voice. He had seen the coin going into a carpet-bag, the dimes and the quarters, and now the dollars. And a man like Cyrus Lofton cannot abide watching a person he has bet against grow rich a dozen eggs at a time. So he did the thing such men always do. He tried to undercut her. He wired down the line, and he had shipped up at his own cost 10 whole crates of cheap eggs out of a cold storage house in the city, eggs that had been held since summer in some great commercial chill room. And he stacked them on the mercantile porch, and he chalked a sign that said, "Fresh eggs, 15 cents." And he stood beside it with his thumbs in his vest and waited to watch the German henwife's trade dry up and blow away. 15 cents. Half her price. He had the longer purse, and he meant to bleed her out. Word reached Adelheid Bower out at the Soddy by noon. She did not wring her hands, and she did not stay home and stew. She filled a basket with a dozen of her own warm eggs gathered that morning, and she walked into town. And she walked straight up onto the mercantile porch, where Cyrus Lofton stood beside his 10 crates and his chalk sign. And a crowd had already gathered the way a crowd gathers when it smells a reckoning. She did not argue the price. She set her basket on a barrel-head, and she asked Hetty Voss in the doorway for a clean skillet and the use of the stove just inside. And she asked Cyrus Lofton, very politely, for the loan of one of his 15-cent eggs. He gave it to her, because to refuse would have looked like fear. She cracked his cold storage egg into the skillet beside one of her own, side by side, in front of the whole town. And the difference was a thing you did not need to be a farmer to read. Her egg stood up tall and bright, the yolk high and round and deep orange as an autumn sun from all the grass and grubs and grasshoppers in it, the white firm and clear. His egg spread out flat and pale and watery, the yolk slack and gray-yellow and broken, the white gone thin as old water, and over the hot iron It gave up the faint but unmistakable low smell of an egg that has been a great many months in this world. Nobody said a word. Nobody had to. A child at the front said loud, "That one's gone off," and pointed at Cyrus Lofton's egg, and the whole porch laughed. But they were not laughing at Adelheid Bower this time. "My eggs are 30 cents the dozen," Adelheid Bower said, into the quiet after the laugh, not loud, "because they were laid this morning by a warm hen, and you may break one open beside any egg in this territory and judge for yourself. His are 15, and you have all just smelled why. I will not sell you a cheap egg. I will only sell you a good one. The choice, as ever, is yours." Then she picked up her basket, and she sold out her dozen on that porch in 2 minutes at full price to people reaching past Cyrus Lofton's crates to get at them, and she walked home. Lofton sold not one egg that day, nor the next. He fed 8 of the 10 crates to his hogs in the end, and he did not try to undercut Adelheid Bower again, because there is no purse long enough to buy back the smell of a bad egg on a hot skillet in front of a whole town. She had not beaten him with money. She had beaten him with a skillet and the plain truth, which were the only 2 weapons she ever needed. By the middle of November, Adelheid Bower had more orders than she had eggs. Her 35 layers, warm and lit and fed off the free bounty of the land, were giving her something near 200 eggs a week, near 17 dozen. And she was selling every last one she could carry to town at 30 cents the dozen. And for the first time since the freight wagon set her down in the road, she had money coming in faster than it was going out. She paid back the dime she owed the widow Halverson and dropped a quarter in the church poor box to square the decency she owed it. She bought a good brass lamp and a tin of good clear oil, so that she would never again have to choose between light for her hens and bread for herself. She bought a roll of real woven wire and built a proper sheltered run on the south wall of the soddy, where the low winter sun could reach the birds and warm them on the bright still days. And then she did the one thing that turns a hard-won living into an empire. She stopped selling all her eggs, and she started keeping some. This is the second half of the secret, and it is the reason the men who bet against her lost a great deal more than $5. Adelheid Bower's hens laid hardest in the autumn and the first cold, when warmth and light were on her side, but the very deepest, blackest, shortest day weeks of December and January would slow even her flock toward a trickle, and the price of an egg in that country ran exactly and perfectly opposite to the supply. Eggs were cheapest in June, when every barnyard hen for 1,000 miles was laying her heart out, and dearest in the dead black middle of winter, when no hen anywhere laid at all. So Adelheid Bower did what her grandmother had done, what careful farm wives had done since before there were farms to do it on. She did not sell every egg she gathered in the plentiful weeks. She put some by against the lean ones. She built herself a cellar. A root cellar, though for her it was an egg cellar, by digging down into the cool creek bank below the soddy where the earth stayed even and cool, a square room hollowed into the bank and roofed over with poles and a thick course of sod. With a stout plank door, she traded 2 dozen eggs to a neighbor to build her. And inside that cool, dark earth room, the temperature held steady and cool the whole year round, winter and summer alike, because the ground 3 and 4 feet down does not care what the wild sky overhead is doing. It holds its own, slow, even cool, the way a deep well holds it, and that is a plain fact of the earth that a root cellar has always lived by. In that steady cool, Adelheid Bower preserved her surplus eggs 2 old ways her grandmother had taught her, 2 ways that are real and old and work exactly as claimed. The first way was water glass. She bought a tin of sodium silicate at the mercantile, a thick, clear stuff like syrup, and dissolved it in boiled, cooled water in a great stone crock at the rate her grandmother had drilled into her, and she lowered clean, dry, unwashed eggs down into it, small end down, layer on careful layer. The silicate seals the porous shell against the air, and a sound fresh egg sunk in water glass in a cool cellar will keep good and whole and fit to eat for the better part of a year. The second way, for the eggs she meant to bring up and sell sooner, was lime water. She slaked good lime into water, let the milk of it settle clear, poured the clear lime water over the eggs in a second crock, and the lime laid a fine sealing skin over each shell that kept the egg sound and sweet for many months. Both were common plain knowledge to any German farm wife, and both looked like black sorcery to a Dakota cattle town. And both did precisely what Adelheid Bower said they did, no more and no less than that. So all through the bright, heavy laying weeks of late autumn, while her warm flock gave more eggs than even hungry Sweetwater Ben could swallow, she sold what the town would buy at 30 cents, and she sank all the rest, crock after crock after crock, down into the cool, dark cellar in water glass and lime. First a few hundred eggs, then near 1,000, then well past it, everyone packed small end down and labeled in her square hand with the week it was laid, banked away against the certain day when the snow would lie deep and no hen in all the wide territory would lay, and the price of a single egg would climb up toward the cold winter moon. She was not merely keeping hens any longer. She was banking sunlight. She was sealing October away in a stone crock to be opened and spent at a fortune in January. The deep, killing cold came the first week of December, and it came down out of the north like a slammed door. A great norther dropped over the Dakota plain on a Tuesday, the temperature falling through the whole gray morning until a man's spit froze before it struck the ground, and the wind came shrieking across 100 unbroken miles with not a tree nor a hill to break its run, and the fine hard snow drove dead sideways and packed itself into long iron ribs across the grass. Sweetwater Bend shut its doors and stuffed its window cracks with rag and waited the storm out by the stove. Out on the open range, where the grass had been free all autumn, the cattle turned their tails to the wind and drifted before it, bawling, walking blind into the white. And Cyrus Lofton, who had bought a great herd of feeder steers on borrowed money, and meant to winter them cheap on the open grass and sell them fat in the spring, stood in his good coat in the door of his fine house and watched his whole investment turn and walk away from him into the storm. It was the kind of cold that kills outright, the kind of gray old Hens had been muttering was overdue, and it settled its weight down over the country and meant to stay a while. The hardest hour of that whole first winter came on the third night of the great norther, and no one ever knew of it but Adelheid Bower and her hens. The water was the trouble. A hen must drink, and drink often, or she stops laying inside a day and dies inside 3. And in a cold that froze the creek hole solid between her morning trip and her evening one, keeping water in front of 35 thirsty hens was a battle fought over and over with no end to it. She could not haul enough from the creek and keep it from skinning to ice before the birds had drunk it. So in the small hours of that third night, by lamplight, with the wind screaming over the sod roof and the cold pressing in through the one cold corner where her own bed was, Adelheid Bauer worked out the answer the way she worked out all of them, with what the land and the house gave her for nothing. She set a flat iron kettle of creek ice on the very back of the banked stove where the heat was least but steady, and she let the stove's own held warmth melt it slow through the night, and she carried the just thawed water warm to the hens at first light, and they drank it gratefully, and they laid. She did that every freezing night the deep cold lasted, getting up alone in the black to feed the fire and turn the kettle, sleeping in snatches in her coat, and not one hen of hers died of thirst that winter, while out on the range the creeks froze to the gravel and the cattle licked snow and starved. It was not witchery. It was a kettle of ice on the back of a stove and a woman who would not let herself sleep through. In her sod house, behind 2 feet of solid prairie turf and under a knitted living roof, Adelheid Bauer banked her little stove a notch higher, trimmed her lamp to burn clean and steady, wrapped her hands and went out into the teeth of the storm twice each day to haul water from the creek hole and feed and gather the eggs. And her hens, warm, lit, dry, and fed, in the very heart of a cold that was killing grown steers out on the range, kept right on laying. Not so hard as in October. Even her flock slowed in the bottomless dark of December, dropping from 17 dozen a week down toward 9, then toward 7. But they laid. They laid while every other hen house in the whole territory had stood silent and frozen for weeks. And whatever she could not gather fresh, she had already banked by the thousand in the cool cellar in water glass and lime. The norther that broke, Cyrus Lofton's back barely brushed her. The 2-foot sod walls the whole town had pitied her for were the warmest walls in the county. The single lamp that the church gossip had named witchery burned on steady through the long black mornings, and the hens laid to it as if to a small caught piece of the sun. There were 2 families that winter Adelheid Bauer never sent a bill to, and I want you to know about them before I tell you who came to her door begging, because the 2 things belong together. There was the widow Mercer out on a failing claim 2 miles east, with 3 small children and a husband 3 months in the ground, and not a hen nor a milk cow to her name. And one black morning in December, Adelheid Bauer drove her wagon out before light, set a basket of 2 dozen warm eggs and a sack of cornmeal on the woman's frozen doorstone, knocked once, and was gone back into the dark before the door opened, so there could be no thanks to suffer through and no charity to refuse. And there was the family of a hired hand named Pell, no kin to her dead bridegroom, only the same common name, who had been crushed under an overturned hay wagon and could not work, and to them she did the same, quiet in the dark, a basket and no word. She told no one, they told no one for a while either, the way proud poor folk do. But a thing like that gets known in the end in a small town, the way the bad things get known, and it got known, and it was remembered when the spring came, and she needed hands. That is a fact about the human heart, and not about hens, but it is part of how she won all the same. The town ran clean out of eggs the week before Christmas. Truly, completely out. The trains came slow, and then not at all through the drifted cuts, and what little crawled through came up frozen and burst in the shell, and the hotel cook and the parson's wife and the doctor's family, and even, at the last, the proud Loftons themselves, found themselves dead in the middle of a hard plains winter with hungry holiday tables and not one egg to be had at any price under heaven, except out past the creek, from the German hen wife, who had warm eggs gathered that very morning, and a cellar full of sound ones besides, and who would sell to anyone at all who came to her door and met her price. And her price had changed, though her conscience had not. She was no gouger. Adelheid Bauer never once in the whole long life that followed charged a sick child or a sinking family 1 cent more than they could bear, and she gave eggs away clean and free that very winter to 2 households that had nothing, and the town saw it and remembered it. But to those who could well afford to pay, in a frozen territory where a fresh egg in January was rarer than a gold piece and twice as welcome, she sold at the going winter price, which ran to 40 cents the dozen, then 50, and in the deepest, darkest week of all to 60 cents the dozen, and worth every copper of it. And she alone, of every soul in 500 miles, had eggs by the basket and the crock to sell. The money came in now not in dimes and quarters, but in folded soft dollars, counted twice and laid away in the same carpet bag that had carried her grandmother's egg cups out from the old country, and that carpet bag began, for the very first time, to grow heavy in her hand. Cyrus Lofton came to her door himself on the day before Christmas. He had lost 40 head of his feed o' steers outright to the norther, and stood in a fair way to lose more before the thaw, and he had a house full of holiday company already arrived, and a wife who wanted eggs for her Christmas baking, and a sister who had publicly eaten her own words about witchery, and would not now lift one finger to help him go and buy them. So he came himself. He stood out in the bitter cold in his fine broadcloth coat, on the swept doorstone of the sod house belonging to the woman he had wagered $5 would be on the October eastbound, and he took off his hat before he knocked, which for a man like Cyrus Lofton was already half the battle of his life. She opened the door. The warm lamplight and the low murmur of the hens came out around her into the cold, and she stood in it and looked at him, and she did not gloat. She had said her one sentence to him on the land office steps back in the gold of September, and she did not need to say it over again, because they both stood there knowing it had come true to the letter. "Mrs. Bauer," he said, "the missus cost him something. She let it pass. I find myself short of eggs for the holiday. I wondered if you'd any to sell." "How many dozen do you need, Mr. Lofton?" "6, if you can spare them." She could spare them. She went down into her cool cellar with the lamp and brought up 6 dozen sound eggs that she had sealed away in water glass back in the bright weeks of October, whole and perfect and good, and she carried them up into the lamplight and packed them in straw in a basket while he waited on the step, and she sold them to Cyrus Lofton at 60 cents the dozen, the full-going winter price, $3.60, and he counted it out in coin into her open hand and did not say one word about it. And then he set his hat back on his head, and before he turned to go down off the doorstone into the dark, he touched the brim of it to her, which, from a man built like Cyrus Lofton, was as close to a public apology as the territory would ever get. And they both knew that, too, and that, the way Sweetwater Bend would tell it around its stoves for 30 winters after, ought to be the end of the whole story. The blonde bride they all swore would starve, selling Christmas eggs at full price to the very man who bet against her on the day before Christmas, by lamplight, in the worst winter, in living memory. It is a fine ending, but it is not where Adelheid Bauer stopped. Because Adelheid Bauer was not at her bottom a woman who knew how to stop at a fine ending. The real story, the one that turned a stubborn survivor into a name the whole territory spoke, did not happen at her door at all. It happened down the long iron line of the railroad, because here is the arithmetic that changed everything. The cold, clear arithmetic Adelheid Bauer worked by lamplight through the long December nights while the snow piled itself against her warm sod walls. Sweetwater Bend was a small town with a small belly. It could eat only so many eggs at any price, and she had already proven she could lay and sell every egg that small belly could hold. But she had a flock that laid clean through the winter, and a cool cellar packed to the rafters with eggs banked against the dark, and an ambition she was beginning to understand in the lamplight that was a great deal bigger than one small frozen town. There were bigger towns down the line. There was Yankton, where she had first stepped off the train. There was Sioux Falls beyond it, and beyond that, the great hungry cities back east, packed full of people who had not seen a fresh egg since the first frost and would pay dearly and gladly for one in the dead of January. And running straight past Sweetwater Bend, west to east, snowbound just now but sure to run again with the thaw, lay the railroad. An egg is a terribly fragile thing to ship 100 miles, and that exact fragility is the whole reason so few people ever shipped them, and the whole reason the few who solved it grew rich. An egg cracks in a jolting freight car. An egg freezes and bursts in a winter boxcar. Most eggs that ever traveled badly and arrived cracked or spoiled or frozen solid, which is the very reason the eggs that limped into Sweetwater Bend from down the line came frozen and half-rotten and dear. But Adelheid Bauer's grandmother had shipped eggs to the city markets over the broken cart roads of the old country, and the girl had the trick of it set down in her head with all the rest. You pack each single egg small end down, never touching its neighbor, bedded deep in clean dry oats or chaff or fine-cut straw, in a stout wooden case with thin dividers so that no egg can knock against another however the car may jolt, and the whole case rides soft and cradled on a bed of grain, packed so a case of eggs can ride 100 miles of rough winter rail and step off whole at the other end. And eggs preserved sound in water glass, good for months, could be shipped in the dead heart of winter to a far city that would pay a king's ransom for them and never once guess they had been laid in October under a lamp in a Dakota soddy. She built her first shipping case in January out of plank she traded a dozen eggs for, fitting thin dividers into it with a dead man's old handsaw, and she packed it with 3 dozen of her best cellar eggs, each one small end down and bedded in oat chaff, and she carried it through the snow to Orrin Task at the freight depot and asked him plainly what it would cost to ship a case of eggs to a commission merchant in Yankton, and what such a merchant might pay for them at the far end. Orrin Task, who had told her the hard truth on her very first day in the road, and had stood by all that long autumn and watched her prove the whole town wrong, told her the truth once again. The freight was dear, he said, and the city commission houses took their cut off the top, no mistake. But a sound case of fresh-kept eggs, he said, turning the case in his careful hands and feeling how snug it rode. Landing in Yankton in the dead of January, when the city's as hungry for a fresh egg as we are out here, only the city's 100 times bigger and 100 times richer. Mrs. Bauer, that'll fetch you a price that's like to make you dizzy. He helped her address the case in his neat ledger hand. He gave her the name of an honest commission house he'd done square dealing with for years, and he would not take his own small fee for the help, because some men, when they have watched a person do an impossible thing with grit and grace, clear through a hard season, decide they would far rather be counted on that person's side than take her dime. She put that first case on the eastbound on a gray January morning with her own hands, and then she did the hardest thing of all for a person who has done everything herself. She let it out of her sight and waited. It is one thing to gather an egg and carry it to a door you can see. It is another to seal 3 dozen of them in a wooden box and trust them to 100 miles of iron rail and a city full of strangers, and to know that if the eggs arrived cracked, or if the merchant was a thief, the whole gamble and the freight money with it were simply gone. She waited 8 days. She fed her hens and trimmed her lamp and gathered her eggs and waited, and she did not say a word about it to anyone, because a woman who has been laughed at does not advertise a bet she might lose. On the 9th day, Orrin Task came out himself through the snow on his own mule with an envelope, because some news a man would rather carry than wire. He sat his mule in her dooryard, and he was grinning before he got his mittens off. The eggs had arrived in Yankton whole, every single one, not a cracked shell in the case, packed small end down so snug that the roughest rail in the territory hadn't touched them, and they had sold off the merchant's counter in a single afternoon in January to people who had not seen a fresh egg in 3 months, and here was the draft for them. Adelheid Bauer opened the envelope standing in the snow and read the figure, and for the second time in her life a number stopped her breath in her chest. The first had been $14 she could not pay. This one she could spend. The first case sold in Yankton for more than Adelheid Bauer had paid to file her whole claim. The second case sold for as much again, and the third, and by the back of February, a steady weekly case was going east off the platform. And then there came a letter, a real letter, on the printed letterhead of the commission house, addressed to the lady who supplied the winter eggs out of Sweetwater Bend, asking most respectfully whether she might supply a great many more, because the merchant's best customers had begun asking for her eggs by name. By name? The German hen wife the whole town had bet would be frozen dead or gone east by October was by the dead black middle of that very first winter shipping eggs by the wooden case to the city and reading letters that begged her for more. She could not supply more, not yet, not with 35 winter hens and a cellar that would stand empty before the spring grass came. And that exact moment, with an honest merchant's letter in her hand begging for eggs she did not have, is the moment a smaller soul would have stopped, well satisfied, a survivor, a good story, an ending. Adelheid Bauer instead sat down by her good brass lamp with a stub of pencil and turned the merchant's letter over, and on the blank back of it she built the whole of the next year. She had already proved out every single piece of it with her own raw hands. She knew now exactly how to keep a flock laying clear through the killing cold. She knew how to bank the autumn glut down in a cool cellar against the winter dearth. She knew how to build a case and pack it so a fragile egg rode 100 miles of bad rail and arrived whole and sound. She knew for a certainty now that there were hungry rich cities down the line that would pay a fortune for what she alone seemed able to make. All she lacked in the whole wide world was scale, more hens, more coops, more cellar room, more hands to gather and pack. And scale she understood at last by the lamplight, was nothing more nor less than doing what she had already done with her own 2 hands, over and over, a little bigger each turn of the year. If you are still with me here in the warm middle of Adelheid Bower's story, and I hope you are, let me ask you that one small kindness again before the spring comes, because it does help more than you know. Tap the like button if this is the kind of story your kitchen needs tonight, and if you have not yet told me where you are listening from, drop the name of your town in a comment. I do read them. Now let me tell you about the morning the first chick hatched, because of all the mornings in this story, that is the one Adelheid Bower herself remembered longest. It came on a soft gray morning, at the very edge of spring, 3 weeks to the day after she had slipped 13 eggs under a broody Dominique hen and marked the date on the soddy wall with a stub of charcoal. She had told the parson's daughter and young Thomas Voss, who hung about the place now whenever his chores let him, that a chick comes when it comes and not a minute before, and that a watched egg is no faster than an unwatched one. And then she had found herself, all 3 of them, crouched in the lamplight over the setting hen at first light, not breathing, listening. There was a sound from under the hen's breast feathers like a fingernail tapping the inside of a teacup. The chick was pipping. It had broken the first small star of a hole in its shell, with the little hard egg tooth on the tip of its beak, the way every chick that has ever hatched has done it, working its way around the wide end of the shell in a slow, patient circle over the better part of a day. And there was nothing on earth anyone could do to help it but leave it be, because a chick must fight its own way out, or it has no strength to live once it is out. So they left it be, and they came back, and left it be, and came back. And in the late afternoon the hen stirred and lifted, and there beneath her, wet and ugly and gasping and alive, was the first chicken born on the Pell Quarter under Adelheid Bower's hand. A small, dark scrap of a thing that within the hour had dried into a round ball of yellow down and was peeping fit to wake the dead and stumbling about under its mother's feet on legs that did not yet quite work. Thomas Voss laughed out loud, and the parson's daughter put her hand over her mouth, and Adelheid Bower, who did not often let her face go all the way open, let it go all the way open then. 12 more came out of that first clutch over the next 2 days, and a dozen broody hens were set behind that one, and a dozen behind those, and the soddy in the yard filled up with the sound of cheeping until you could not hear yourself think. And every one of those chicks was next winter's eggs, and the winter after that, the whole empire compounding itself one yellow scrap at a time, the way money compounds in a bank, only warmer. That is the thing about hens that the cattleman never grasped. A steer is a steer. You sell it once, and it is gone. A hen makes more hens, and lays besides. And Adelheid Bower had understood from the first that she was not in the egg business at all, not really. She was in the business of compounding sunlight and grass into more hens and more eggs, year over year, and there is no end to a number that doubles. So she spent her first winter's profit not on a soft bed, nor a board floor, nor a single comfort for herself, but on the next year's empire. When the thaw finally broke and the spring came, and her steady Dominique hens grew warm and restless and broody, she set them to the oldest arithmetic in all of farming. A broody Dominique will sit a clutch of 13 eggs faithful as a clock for 3 full weeks, and hatch you out a round dozen chicks and mother them fierce and clucking, through the dangerous first days when a chick is all appetite and no sense. And Adelheid Bower set every broody hen she owned and traded eggs for more hatching eggs from the widow Halverson and from Greta's sister down the creek, two women who now counted themselves proudly among her friends. Through that first green spring, her flock climbed from the 38 birds that had come through the winter to better than 200. She built a second coop of sod with her own hands, warmer and longer than the first, with the same deep litter floor and the roosts on the warm inner wall and the place set ready for the winter lamp. She hired the parson's eldest daughter, a serious girl of 16 who needed the wages, to help with the morning gathering, and she took the dead man's old plow and broke a single acre of the good Black Creek bottom he had written to her about. And she planted it not in wheat, as every man in the territory would have told her to, but in oats and millet and tall sunflowers, feed for her flock, and clean dry bedding for her shipping cases, so that come the next winter she would not have to buy a single sack of grain nor a single armful of straw off any man alive. It was the plow that turned up the secret on a warm afternoon in May, and the secret was the one thing in all of this that Adelheid Bower had not planned and could not have planned. She was walking the plow behind a borrowed ox along the lowest fold of the creek bottom, where the black soil ran deepest, when the share struck something that was not stone and was not root. It rang. Stone does not ring, and a buried root does not ring. And Adelheid Bower stopped the ox and knelt down in the fresh-turned furrow and dug with her hands the way she had dug for water her first night on the land. What came up out of the black dirt was an iron box, a small, strong box eaten orange with rust, its lid sprung loose by the plowshare no bigger than the bread tin on her shelf. And inside it, wrapped in the rotted remains of an oilcloth, were two things. There was a small, soft leather poke, heavy out of all proportion to its size, and there was a folded square of paper, gone brown and brittle as a dead leaf. The poke held gold, not a great fortune, but 11 gold coins, old ones, heavy and worn, and Adelheid Bower, who had once counted her whole life at $11.40, knelt in the furrow with 11 gold pieces in her two hands and a roaring in her ears. The paper held the rest of it. She carried it carefully up to the soddy and unfolded it on the table by the window, where the light was good, and she read it 3 times, the way you read a thing that matters. It was a letter in a faded hand dated 60 years before, 1822, a generation before there was a Sweetwater Bend or a Dakota Territory or a railroad within 500 miles. And it was written by a French fur trader named Etienne Renard to a daughter he plainly never reached. He had buried his season's gold against the winter and the Sioux and the river ice, he wrote, here at the bend where the cottonwood stood thickest, meaning to come back for it in the spring and carry it east to her. He had drawn a small, careful map of the creek bend in the margin. He had signed it with love, and he had never come back, because something on that long-ago frontier had stopped him cold, the way the spring ice had stopped Tom Pell, the way the frontier stopped so many men a few feet short of the thing they were reaching for. And his gold had lain in the black dirt at the bend of the creek for 60 years, under the grass, under the buffalo, under the feet of the dead man who had written her that he would not let her go hungry, waiting for a plow. Adelheid Bower did the honest thing, because she did not know another kind. She carried the letter and the map into Orrin Task at the depot, who knew the history of that whole country better than any living soul, and together they followed the thread of it, through the old fur company ledgers Orrin kept in a trunk, through the memory of the oldest man in the county, a half-blind trapper of 90 who had known the Reynard name as a boy, and the thread ran out, as old threads do. Etienne Renard's daughter had died childless in St. Louis, 40 years gone. There was no heir living to carry the gold to. The law and the old trapper and Orrin Task all agreed, and the county clerk agreed, that the gold belonged to the land, and the land belonged now to Adelheid Bower, free and clear and lawfully proved. She had not gone looking for a buried fortune. She had gone looking for nothing grander than a way to feed her hens, and the land she had been mocked for filing on, the worthless Pell quarter that 3 men on a porch had bet she'd be run off of by October, had been holding a dead Frenchman's gold for 60 years under its black skin, waiting for the one person stubborn enough to break it. She did not spend the gold on herself. She spent it the way she spent everything, on the next turn of the year. 8 of the 11 coins went into the second coop, and the wire and the lumber for the packing shed and the breaking of the creek bottom acre. 2 she sewed into the lining of the carpet bag against a hard winter that might yet come, because a woman who has stood in a clerk's office with $14 to find and 11 cents in her hand does not ever again let herself be caught empty. And 1 coin, a single old worn gold piece, she had drilled through and hung on a thin chain, and she wore it the rest of her long life under her dress where no one could see it, not for the gold of it, but for the man who had buried it with love and never come back, and for the other man who had built her good stout walls and written her a half-sentence and gone through the ice. 2 men who had reached for a thing and fallen a few feet short of it. She meant to be the one who did not fall short. She wore the coin to remember why. I told you a little while back that she gave eggs away free that first hard winter to 2 households that had nothing, and I want to come back to that now, before I bring this home, because it is the other whole half of how Adelheid Bower won, and it is the half the loud men on the mercantile porch never once had it in them to understand. She could have squeezed that town white in its hungry winter. She held the only eggs for 500 miles in any direction, and the town had laughed at her in the road and bet against her over its whiskey, and a smaller, harder soul would have made every last one of them crawl and pay through the nose for the pleasure of it. She did not. She charged the going price to those who could plainly pay it, and not 1 penny over, and she charged nothing whatsoever to a widow with 3 small children freezing on a failing claim 2 miles east, and nothing to the family of a hired man who had been hurt bad under an overturned wagon and could not work. And she did it quiet, walking out in the dark to leave a straw-packed basket on a doorstone and walking away again before anyone could come to the door and try to thank her or refuse it. And when the spring came and her empire truly began, those were the very neighbors who turned up unasked to help her raise the second sod coop, who minded her setting hens while she rode to town, who carried her name on down the line, not as the German hen wife any longer, but as Adelheid Bower of Sweetwater Bend, who would deal you square and keep her given word and feed your children through a black winter, whether your purse was full or flat empty. A name like that, a word like that, In a raw frontier country where every soul's survival hung on whether a neighbor's word was good when the chips were down, was worth more in the long running of it than all the eggs in all her crocks. It was the bedrock the whole tall thing stood up on, and the men on the porch had bet against the one thing they had never thought to count. The prairie fire came in the dry end of that second summer, and it was the day Sweetwater Bend stopped laughing at Adelheid Bower for good and began, instead, to be a little afraid of how much it had underestimated her. It had been a dry year. The grass that had crawled with grasshoppers her first autumn stood tall and gold and tinder dry by August, 160 acres of it and 10,000 more beyond her fences, and every soul on the high plains knew what dry, tall grass and a dry, hot wind could make between them. It started, they said afterward, from a spark off a passing locomotive stack away off to the west, and the same hard west wind that had nearly killed her cattle buyers' steers in the north of the winter before now drove a wall of fire east across the open range straight at the homesteads strung along the creek. Adelheid Bower saw the smoke on the western sky at mid-morning, a brown smudge that grew while she watched into a brown mountain, and she did not panic, and she did not run, and she did not waste 1 minute of the single hour the wind would give her. She had near 500 birds now in 2 coops, and a packing shed half full of cased eggs, and a cellar of water-glass crocks, and a standing crop of oats and millet, and a whole year's empire that a wall of fire would take in 4 minutes and leave as black ground and white bone. So she did the one thing the old Hens swore by, and the green ones never got done in time. She made a fire break, and then she made a backfire, the plainest and the most dangerous frontier skill there is. And it works for the soundest reason in the world. Fire cannot cross ground that has nothing left on it to burn. She harnessed the ox to the dead man's plow and drove it at a stumbling run, shouting at it in 2 languages, and she plowed a wide, bare furrow belt clean around the soddy and both coops and the shed and the cellar mouth. 3 passes, then 4. The bright steel turning the dry sod under and laying open a ring of bare brown earth. And then, with the fire's own roar already loud on the west wind, and the rabbits and the quail already streaming past her through the grass running east ahead of it, she walked the inner edge of her plowed ring with a burning twist of grass in her hand, and she set her own small fire on purpose against the grass between the plow line and her buildings, and she beat it and steered it with a wet grain sack so that it burned inward and met itself and ate up every blade of fuel in a black scorched apron around everything she owned, and then died for want of one more dry blade to take. When the great fire came, it came like the end of the world, a roaring orange wall as tall as the soddy, throwing a heat she could feel blister close from 40 yards off, and it ran up to the black scorched ground Adelheid Bower had made for it, and it stopped. It could not cross. There was nothing left on that ground for it to eat. It split and ran around her ring of bare earth to the north and to the south and roared away east into the next man's grass. And it left her soddy and her 2 coops and her shed and her 500 birds standing untouched in the middle of a smoking black island in a burned black sea. She had lost not one single hen. The neighbors who came riding through the smoke at dusk, black-faced and red-eyed, half of them expecting to dig the German henwife and her chickens out of the ashes, found her instead standing on her own untouched doorstone with the scorched wet sack still hanging from her hand and 500 hens grumbling safe behind her in the dusk. Old Greta Halverson looked a long moment at the plowed ring and the backfire scar, and she crossed herself, and she said, she plowed a wall the fire couldn't climb. Lord help the man who ever bets against that woman again. And from that day to the end of her long life in Sweetwater Bend, no man ever did. By the second winter, Adelheid Bauer was shipping eggs by the case east on the railroad every single week, and commission merchants in 3 separate cities now asked for her by name, and the price she drew for a winter egg kept sound in her cool cellar and packed small end down to ride the rail whole, made the carpet-bag heavier than her grandmother's wildest old country dream of America had ever dared to run. She could have kept the 2 secrets to herself. A harder soul would have. Warmth and light were the whole of her advantage, and a woman who has been laughed at has every reason to lock her one advantage in a box and sit on the lid. Adelheid Bauer did the opposite, and it made her richer than hoarding ever could have. One bright, cold afternoon late in the second winter, she gathered the women of the creek into her own warm coop. Greta Halverson and the parson's wife and 3 or 4 others who had once ridden out to find a witch, and she taught them plainly everything. She showed them the deep litter and made them push their bare hands down into it to feel the slow heat rising in it. She showed them the single lamp and how a hen counts the light and not the clock. She showed them the kettle on the back of the stove for the water, and the snail shell lime, and the grit, and the water glass crocks down in the cool cellar, and the cases packed small end down in oat chaff. She held nothing back. Why? Greta Halverson asked her, blunt as ever, when the others had gone. You give away the whole of it. They'll lay eggs against you now. They will lay eggs with me, Adelheid Bauer said. There is one railroad, and there are 100 cities, Greta, and there are more hungry mouths back east than this whole valley could fill if every hen in it laid twice a day. I cannot lay enough eggs alone. But if every woman on this creek keeps a warm winter flock and brings her eggs to my shed, I will keep them sound and pack them whole and find a city, and we will all of us eat through a hard winter and none of us go on the eastbound. A secret kept feeds one woman. A secret given feeds a valley. And that, in the end, was the largest piece of the whole arithmetic, the piece the loud men had never once thought to count. By the third winter, the neighbor women up and down the creek were keeping their own winter hens by her method, warm and lit, and selling their eggs through her, because Adelheid Bauer did not, in the end, need to lay every egg in the territory with her own flock. She needed only to be the one who knew how to keep them all sound and pack them all whole, and find the far hungry city that would pay, and let the whole Green Valley lay the eggs and bring them to her shed. She built a long plank packing shed hard by the rail spur, with rows of dividers and tins of water glass and barrels of clean oat chaff. She bought, in good time and with cash money, the very next quarter section that ran alongside her own. The town that had bet $5 she'd be gone by October bought their eggs from her counter year-round and were glad to. And Cyrus Lofton, broken on the open range by the very same norther that had made her rich behind her 2-foot walls, ended his proud, loud career hauling freight wagons of egg cases down to the depot for her for honest, steady wages, and she never once in all the years threw a single word of it back in his face, which is the surest and final sign of all that she had, truly, completely and forever one. But the truest measure of the whole thing came on a bright, bitter morning in that third winter, when a stranger stepped down off the eastbound train at the little Sweetwater Bend platform, a buyer in a heavy fur-collared coat, come all that long cold way from a great commission house back east for the one purpose of finding out who, in this little Dakota nowhere, was shipping sound fresh eggs by the case in the dead of winter, when the whole rest of the country had none to send. He went straight to Orrin Task at the depot window and asked where a man might find the egg merchant of Sweetwater Bend. And Orrin Task, who had told a frightened, friendless girl the plain truth on her very first morning in that road, 3 winters gone, set down his pen and smiled, and pointed the stranger out past the creek, out to the long packing shed by the rail spur and the trim sod house beyond it, with the brass lamp burning warm and steady in the window, even now in the broad daylight, out of pure habit, where a woman with a flaxen braid just beginning to go gray at the temples stood in her swept dooryard in a good warm wool coat she had bought with egg money, with a basket of warm eggs steaming faintly on her arm, in a frozen country where no other hen for 500 miles in any direction was laying so much as one, exactly as she had stood on her first frosted October morning, only now there were near 1,000 hens behind her instead of 41, and a whole valley laying to her method, and a railroad carrying her name east every week to far cities full of people who knew her eggs by name and would never once know her face. The buyer walked out across the frozen ground and took off his fur-collared hat in the wind. He told her plainly that his house would take every egg she could ship all winter, every winter, for as many years as she cared to ship them, at a price he named that made even Adelheid Bower's steady gray eyes go wide for the space of a single heartbeat. And then he asked her the question that everyone in one form or another had been asking since the freight wagon first set her down in the road with a crate of complaining chickens and $11.40 and a whole town full of men who had already decided exactly how her story would end. He asked her how she had done it, how one woman alone, with nothing, in the hardest country God ever made, had built the richest winter egg trade in the whole of the territory. Adelheid Bower looked out past his shoulder at the wide white plain and at the iron rail line running straight east toward all those far hungry cities, and at the warm sod house her dead husband's good stout walls and her grandmother's 2 plain secrets had built between them, and she gave the buyer the very same answer she had given the sewing circle in her warm coop 3 winters before, the only true answer there had ever been. "There is no trick," she said. "A hen lays for warmth and for light. Anyone at all can keep her warm. Anyone at all can keep her lit. Most people simply will not do it all the way through a long cold winter, getting up alone in the black dark to trim a lamp for the sake of a chicken. And so they go without, and they call it luck or witchery in the few of us who do not go without. I kept the lamp burning. That is the whole of it. That has always been the whole of it. There is one more small thing, and then I will let you go. The spring after that third winter, on a bright morning with the chicks cheeping in the yard and the first case of the week already gone east on the train, Adelheid Bower walked into the mercantile and asked Hetty Voss for the little bundle on the high shelf, the 6 German egg cups, white with the thin gold line, wrapped in the linen these 3 years against the day she might want them back. She paid the same $2.70 to the penny and would not let Hetty take less. And she carried her grandmother's egg cups home to the soddy at last, and set them on the window sill where the morning light came in, and she ate her breakfast egg out of one of them every morning of her life thereafter. It was the only thing she ever bought back. Everything else she had built new. And that is the whole of it. The blonde bride and her hens did not starve, nor freeze, nor go east on any eastbound. By that first winter, the town was buying her eggs at her own price. By the third winter, the territory was, and by then the great cities back east were sending men in fur collars out into the dead of a Dakota January just to find her. All of it because one tired young woman with $11.40 knotted in her hem and 41 chickens in a slatted crate simply refused to let a single small lamp go out, and refused just as flatly to let the whole loud, certain, betting world tell her how her own story was going to end. If this story warmed your kitchen tonight, the way Adelheid Bower's one small lamp warmed her hens through that long winter, do me again that one small kindness I asked of you at the very start. Tap the like button so that the next person who needs to hear about somebody the world wrote off too early and too easily can find their own way here to this warm kitchen. And leave me a comment with the name of the town you're listening from tonight, wherever in this wide country you are, because I do truly read every single one of them, and somewhere out there in the dark right now, in some little place not so different from Sweetwater Bend, someone is being told they will not last a season. And they would do very well, that someone, to remember a blonde girl, a crate of complaining hens, and one stubborn lamp that did not go out.